Well, hello friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we are going to talk about the EVM-12L. This is the 20-pound monstrosity that Electro-Voice introduced in 1983. See, I'm struggling to lift it up. Yeah, we're going to talk about the difference between the EV, which is a cast frame speaker. We're going to talk about the difference between that and, of course, the pressed frame, steel pressed frame speaker like we're used to. Going to talk about that. Going to talk about the differences in sound. We're going to do a little bit of a comparison. We're going to talk about the advantages of each and kind of what they're doing. Talk about kind of response time and kind of how the EV acts like a piston, and what an amazing engine it has. And also some of the things that there's a lot of hurdles. Like, let's say you want to use an EV speaker. It's not like you can just slap one into your deluxe reverb or what have you. So we're going to talk about that too. The logistics if, like, let's say you wanted to use an EV speaker in your rig. So yeah, and we're just going to have fun. All right, so while I'm thinking about it, I just appreciate my Patreon followers. They are fantastic. If you're interested in joining them, there's a link in the description. Also, I do a lot of content on Instagram, and you can follow me there. I'll put a link to that in the description also. Yeah, and then I just appreciate people that put money in the tip jar and buy merch and stuff like that. I really appreciate everyone supporting the show. I'm grateful. All right, let's dive in. So, of course, this episode in some way is a response video to the JBL video I did a year or so ago. And in a nutshell, the JBL was kind of the first kind of higher wattage cast frame, speaker. And then of course you kind of get other speakers coming along like the Altec Lansing, which of course kind of comes from James B. Lansing and other things. And you get, Electro-Voice was really primarily making microphones, and of course they were making other products too, but they really didn't get into the speaker world as far as musical instruments until into the 70s. And that's when we start seeing EV speakers in guitar amps. And the first ones were the SRO, which was this Alnico magnet with the big coffee can cover on the magnet. And that was a popular speaker, but not nearly as popular as, let's say, the JBL or even the Altec. So EV releases a ceramic magnet, EVM-12L, in 1983. And it's a big deal. And it's a big deal because it is a more neutral sounding speaker than the JBL or the Altec. So the JBL had, really, the D120 only had about a 40 watt rating, and the K120 had probably a 60 watt rating. And they also had this aluminum dust cover in the middle. Here, let's point to the dust cover. This is of course on a this is on a Eminence Alessandro speaker, but this part on a JBL is much bigger, and it's metal. And so what that does is it extends the frequency range of the speaker. It kind of widens it. And so with that, you get the stereotypical chirp. You get this sound that is part of the lure and the lore and the love of the JBL speaker, was this aluminum dust cover that gave you extended high end and gave you a chirp on the notes. Well, a lot of people loved them. A lot of people hated them. And so when EV came out with the EVM-12L, and again, I'm going to lift this monstrosity, and you had this gigantic dust cover that was not metal. Well, it created a smoother, more neutral sound, and it wasn't really hyping the high end. And so EV had created this speaker that was a little more flat in its response than, let's say, the JBL. So it becomes very popular, and many pro guitar players start using the EV speaker. So you have everyone from Eric Clapton, who would use them with Soldanos in the later 80s, but would even use them with red knob twins and Marshalls. And Clapton and others would take Marshall 412s and they would pull out the Celestion speakers and they'd put EVs in there. And that was a very, very common thing. Mark Knopfler had been using EVs for a while. He had been using EVs with perhaps with the Music Man amps, but absolutely, but with the Boogie amps he was using. And then also when Knopfler went over to using the Soldano amps in the late 80s, he was using EV speakers with them. Stevie Ray Vaughan, who had been using different types of JBLs, be it the D120s, K120s, even the E120s and 130s and such, he switched over pretty much completely to EV speakers in all of his Fender type and Dumble amplifiers. And of course, Dumble used a variety of speakers early on, including Altecs, but when the EV series came out, he began using the 12L a lot, and also he would use the 12S, which is a variation that has a little shallower basket. And because of that, it tends to have a little bit more mid-range, and that's the EV that at times Larry Carlton would use, and Pete Anderson, who of course is a favorite guitar player of mine, and he was using Altec and EV speakers in his deluxe reverb amplifiers. So this was like early on in the Dwight Yoakam years. Pete he had two deluxe reverb amps. And he had one of them had an Altec in it, and the other one had an EVM-12S, and that 12S is I think mainly what you hear on a lot of those first couple records. So, and definitely the live stuff that's available. So EV really kind of took over. They kind of displaced JBL as the big, especially high-end guitar speaker. Now, EVs were not put in, a lot of your run-of-the-mill amplifiers. It was usually an upgrade, or it was with more of your boutique amp, which even like Mesa Boogie would have very much been considered a boutique amplifier in the 70s and 80s, really. And they, of course, they had an upgrade. You could get an EV, and they even had an in-house EV with the Black Shadow name on it, but it was just an EVM-12L. Let's talk a little bit about the cast frame to stamped frame. So here is one of my favorite stamped frame speakers, and I don't like this in everything, but I especially like this in I gig a lot with a Headstrong Little King, which is basically a Princeton with a 12-inch speaker. It's not hot rodded in any other way. And this is mainly what I use on my show, and I gig with it. And it came with this speaker in it, and I really like it a lot. However, I bought another one, which is this one right here, and I tried putting it in my deluxe, and I didn't like it as much because I kind of like a speaker with more mids, like a Vintage 30 or even like a G12-65 or ET-65 from Warehouse. But yeah, I really like this speaker in a Princeton, because a Princeton has more mids to it than a deluxe does, because a Princeton doesn't have as much bandwidth. It just can't, because of smaller transformers and everything. So it ends up being a little more mid-rangey sounding than a deluxe. And so this speaker works really well in it. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about stamped frame. So this is steel that's stamped into this shape, and then they attach the magnet, and of course they have a paper cone, and you know, it's got some kind of material that's put as a strengthener here on the surround here. And then this one has a felt dust cover, and that's nice because it kind of smooths out the highs. And so this is a good speaker. So this weighs 7.5 pounds, and it handles 40 watts. And yeah, good little speaker. So now let's get the monstrosity, and I think I'm gonna have to put my my old Strat down so I don't end up crashing into it. So here we go. Yeah, EVM-12L. This is 20 pounds, okay? So this is a cast frame, die cast, you know, speaker frame. And so it weighs a ton. It weighs 20 pounds. It's 12.5 pounds heavier than the other speaker. That's a lot more to carry around. As you can see, it also has a much bigger dust cover in the middle. It is made of heavier, you know, paper. The cone material has this really strong surround on it. And then of course you have a gigantic magnet that's covered with a heat sink. So you may be thinking, why does that EV look different than the ones that I've seen? Well, that's because this one has a heat sink on it. And so here you can see I've removed one. That's because I've got the other EV of this pair is actually, you know, plugged in right now. And I had to take this off just so it'd fit in the amplifier. And so this is to dissipate heat, and it's made of aluminum, and it has these, you know, whatchamacallits on here, you know, that help dissipate the heat. Someone's gonna have fun, yeah, just because I've gone blank. But yeah, so, but if you take this off, the amp loses about, I mean, not the amp, the speaker loses about 2 pounds. So, but yeah, and again, you take this off, it looks like a regular EV. All right. So what's different? You know, so we've talked about the construction. Obviously, you know, these are much more expensive to make. They have a much bigger magnet on them, ceramic magnet. And so what's the difference in tone? Well, I'm gonna do a little bit of playing example, but let's just talk about what's happening. Well, with the EV, it's like having this gigantic engine that just is able to do whatever you want in a split second. And so its reaction time is very different. So when you're using an EV speaker, it's pumping out the note. It pumps it out. It does it exactly. It has a quick response time. Also, it will come to rest, you know, with how you play. It doesn't, you know, kind of keep wiggling around or just kind of, you know, continuing to resonate for no reason. The stamped frame speaker doesn't have the same kind of response time really, and it doesn't come to rest in the same way. And that's because it just doesn't have the engine behind it. It doesn't have the gigantic magnet and the suspension and everything else. So there's just a way in which the stamped frame speaker will kind of have some other artifacts going on, which a lot of people like. And you know, some people will say with the EV, it sounds more sterile. And it's not that it sounds sterile, it's just that it's not really adding a lot to the situation. It's doing exactly what it's told to do. It's kind of vanilla, neutral, but extremely accurate and extremely powerful. And it just spits out exactly what's put into it. Now, does that mean it sounds bad? No, it sounds great. It has a great sound to it, and you just kind of have to get used to it. But that's the sound, you know, if you heard, you know, Stevie Ray Vaughan would have recorded with the same, you know, gear that he used out on the road, which especially by the, you know, by like In Step or such, would absolutely have been all EV stuff. I'm sure he used some other amplifiers too, but the core stuff, the Dumble and the super reverbs and the vibroverbs and all those things would have all been EV equipped. You know, again, Clapton, Knopfler, you know, so much of the boogie stuff and the Dumble stuff is all EV speakers. Yeah, it kind of spits out exactly what it's given. And a lot of guys like EV speakers because they really let the sound of the amplifier come through. They're not adding coloration. So a guy like Pete Anderson would love an EV because the only distortion is going to come from the tubes. It's not going to come from the speaker. It really lets the amplifier and the transformers and everything kind of come through the sound. There's not this other layer of coloration coming through, or again, distortion. Going back to the response time of the speaker, a lot of guys that are fast, precise players like the EV and the JBL. And so a guy like Albert Lee back in the day, he would always, you know, prefer to use an amplifier that had EVs or JBLs. And that was because of the speed with which he played and the response time that he wanted. Now, is this saying if you're a fast player, you have to use EVs? No, not at all. It's a personal preference thing. I mean, if you think about Brent Mason played tons of incredibly fast guitar parts that were run through, you know, most likely Celestion Vintage 30s. You know, he used a couple of cabinets and had his deluxe reverb had a Vintage 30 in it, and he had a twin, and he had a basement cab that all had Vintage 30s in them. And that was kind of his, you know, a lot of the sound that you heard with Brent when he was using Fender amps. So on a lot of those Alan Jackson things, you know, you're hearing Vintage 30s and he's playing plenty fast. What you get with the stamped frame speaker is you get more smear. So it's kind of like you hit the note and it kind of smears it around a little bit, while the EV is just super accurate. It's just hitting the dot and coming back. While with the stamped frame speaker, and then depending on what kind of stamped frame speaker, whether it's a Jensen or an Oxford or a Celestion or whatever, you know, it gets its own smear. Like a Celestion Blue has a certain smear to the note, and people love it, and people love Celestion Blues. But yeah, all, you know, kind of lower wattage stamped frame speakers just tend to have kind of a smear to the note, and that's a thing. But so is having an EV or a JBL. And I think the EV had even an advantage over the JBL because it didn't smear and it didn't have the coloration of the aluminum dome. And I think the EV worked better with a lot of distortion and effects. And that's why the studio cats, of course, they were running direct a lot, but otherwise, a lot of times the studio guys in the 80s and 90s, especially in LA in the 80s, you know, they were using Electro-Voice speakers. They had them in their Rivera modded amplifiers, and they had them in, in wedges and cabs when they had their racks with the power amps in them. Most of the time, the speaker cabs that they used with them were like these 112 Pacific cabs that had EVs in them. All right. Well, I think we've done enough talking about this, so I'm going to do a comparison where I'm going to play some things on the with the EV, and then I'm going to compare it to the Alessandro. And so again, I'm using my Strat, and the only effect that I have on is I have a little bit of compression coming from a Mirage compressor, and the amp is my Little King, which is 12 watts, and this is the speaker in it. And then I have a similar sized speaker cabinet because I wanted to get as close as possible. So I have a similar sized speaker cabinet that I have the EVM-12L in, and so I'm going to play some examples on each, and then we'll wrap it up. One thing I want to give credit to That Pedal Show. They did a great EV episode, and the strongest thing about it is that they basically did all, mostly audio examples. I mean, they talk about it too, and those guys are brilliant. They're great. But they play a bunch of different amplifiers. So you get to hear, a Princeton and like a Marshall and a matchless and a Vox, and you get to hear them all. And it's interesting in that they like the EV best with the Vox and the Fender, but they don't really like the EV as much with the Marshall or the matchless. All right, so we're gonna do a couple examples. All right, so now you've listened and you've decided that you love the EV sound and you just gotta have one in your amp. Well, here are the logistical things to think about. One is that the bolts that are in your amp, in your amplifier, they are probably not long enough. A lot of amplifiers have really short bolts coming out. Now, some of them have, inset where, of course, you actually use bolts that you screw from the back, while other ones have bolts that are sticking out that are usually pointed. But most of the time, either one are not going to be long enough. You're lucky in that if you have the just the receptacle in the amp, you can just buy longer bolts and you can put them in there. However, the other thing to think about is that you're putting a 20-pound speaker where probably a 5 to 10-pound max speaker was, and you could easily bust your baffle board, especially if you're going down the road and your amp has a 20-pound speaker in it instead of a 5 to 10-pound speaker in it, and you hit a bump or something like that, or an amp gets knocked over. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is that baffle board is going to go kaput. So what a lot of guys do that are way into EVs, especially if you're into old Fender amps, is they get a new baffle board made of thicker, stronger wood, with aged growth cloth or whatever you want to do, and they have, longer bolts on it too. And sometimes they even have to move where the speaker cutout is so that it doesn't hit a transformer or something else on the amp. So this is not a real simple operation at times to kind of squeeze an EV, especially into a 112 combo amp. It's problematic. So you have the weight problem, you have the fact that it could crack your baffle, you have the bolt problem, you have number of bolts, so those are kind of the considerations for that. The easiest thing is probably to get a separate speaker cabinet, but of course that's a whole nother thing to lug and such. It might be good to separate the weight out. So that's another thing to weigh over, and if the EV sound is just the end all be all. Yeah, the EV just has a more neutral response. It's kind of like it's almost like the perfect speaker for like a modeling amplifier, because you could switch up things and it would it always just kind of give you a fast, honest response thing. So, all right, guys, well, thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.